Hello and welcome to IB Biology Notes with Dr. Kimo. This is B2.1 Membranes and Membrane Transport. This topic is about the different ways in which particles move across the membrane, especially the cell membrane. All cells are surrounded by a membrane. The membrane forms a border between the cell and its surroundings. All cell membranes consist of a bilayer of phospholipids and other amphipathic molecules. And this is something you can learn more about in A21 and B12. Other membranes, like those around some organelles, for example mitochondria, have the same basic structure. The lipid bilayer acts as a barrier between the cell and its surroundings. Now you may remember that the membrane core is hydrophobic. It consists of fatty acids, and fatty acids do not dissolve well in water, so they are hydrophobic. The bilayer has low permeability to hydrophilic particles. Low permeability means that things do not easily go through. The bilayer does not easily let hydrophilic particles through. Particles like large polar molecules, charged molecules, and ions. However, hydrophobic particles pass through more easily. Permeability also depends on size. For example, glucose does not pass through, whereas water does to some extent, because water is so much smaller than glucose. Let's start with the most simple type of transport across membranes, simple diffusion. Now, particles are in continuous motion, except at absolute zero. And the higher the temperature, the faster the motion. If you, for example, put a dye in a beaker of water, like in the illustration here, the dye will start to spread in the beaker until the concentration is the same all over. There is a net movement from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. You can see this in the beaker because the dye molecules in the droplet will start to spread from the droplet where the concentration is high to the other parts of the beaker where the concentration is low. This is called simple diffusion, and it also happens across membranes. Now, this illustration shows how small nonpolar molecules in the extracellular fluid, so outside the actual cell, pass through the membrane spontaneously, and they move into the cell because the concentration is higher outside than inside, and over time they will move into the cell until the concentration is the same outside and inside. An example of simple diffusion, which you will be learning more about in B31, is when oxygen in your lungs moves from the air sacs, called alveoli, into the blood. Water molecules are able to move through most cell membranes due to their small size. When more water molecules move in one direction than the other, we call it osmosis. And this requires a semi-permeable membrane through which water, but not solutes, can pass. In this illustration, you can see a semi-permeable membrane, and to the left you have pure solvent, only water, and to the right you have a solution with water and a solute. So the yellow spheres are water molecules, the blue spheres are solute molecules. Now, water does move in both directions, but there is a net movement to where the solute concentration is higher, because solutes form hydrogen bonds with water molecules and inhibit their movement. So the water on the right is not able to move through the membrane as fast as the water on the left. Looking at this illustration, a way to remember which way the water moves is to consider the water concentration as being higher to the left than to the right. And if you count the number of spheres, there are more yellow spheres on the left than on the right. Now, over time, this is what happens. More water will be moving from the left to the right, and the water level will rise on the right side. At some point, the water level will rise so much that the pressure is higher on the right and will push back the movement of water. So the net movement of water stops. So the end point in this case would be different water levels on the left versus on the right because of the net movement of water from the left to the right. You will be learning more about osmosis in D2.3. The other modes of transport across membranes require proteins. There are many different proteins in the lipid bilayer. Not all of them have to do with transport, but some do. There are two major categories: integral proteins and peripheral proteins. The integral ones are hydrophobic, at least partially. They are embedded in one or both phospholipid layers, and some of them are transmembrane. They go all the way through the membrane, and they have hydrophilic ends. The peripheral proteins have a hydrophilic surface. They are not embedded in the membrane, but they are attached to the membrane through an integral protein, or they can be anchored with a hydrocarbon chain that is inserted in the membrane. Now you know about simple diffusion and about proteins in the membrane. For some cells' needs, diffusion of water through the lipid bilayer is too slow, so they have something called aquaporins. Aquaporins are transmembrane channel proteins which allow water to flow through. They have a very narrow positively charged passage, which stops larger molecules and also, for example, protons. This is a type of facilitated diffusion, and it is common in, for example, the kidney and in root hair cells. These are things that you will learn more about later. There are also other channel proteins which allow selected particles to cross the membrane. They are integral transmembrane proteins, and they connect the inside of a cell with the outside. They allow certain particles to pass and are very selective. Some of them can be opened or closed. And aquaporin is one such channel protein. Facilitated diffusion through a channel protein does not require energy, so it is a form of passive transport, just like simple diffusion and osmosis. Pump proteins consume energy as they actively pump particles across the membrane. This is called active transport. Pump proteins only work in one direction and usually against a concentration gradient. This illustration shows how sodium ions in orange are moving from the cytoplasm to the extracellular space in the direction of the arrow. The concentration of sodium is already higher in the extracellular space, but more sodium ions are still being pumped into that extracellular space. That's what we mean by against their concentration gradient. After the sodium ions have been released into the extracellular space, Potassium ions are being moved from the extracellular space to the cytoplasm by the same pump protein. Potassium is also moving against its concentration gradient because the concentration of potassium is already higher inside the cell, in the cytoplasm. The energy is provided by ATP. More about that in C12. You will also learn about this sodium-potassium pump in more detail if you are doing higher level. That's in A2-150 later in this video. Cell membranes are selectively permeable because, as you know by now, the cell can decide what goes in and out with the help of facilitated diffusion and active transport. The selections can differ depending on the cell's needs. This is more than just semi-permeable, where some particles spontaneously go through and some don't, because of their size, for example. However, the cell cannot stop small hydrophobic particles from diffusing across the membrane. So, cell membranes are said to be both selectively permeable and semi-permeable at the same time. Sometimes this combination is called partially permeable. There are lots of different proteins in the cell membrane. Some are called glycoproteins because they are linked to a carbohydrate. There are also glycolipids, which are lipids linked to a carbohydrate. These have a role in cell-to-cell recognition and immune response. In some cells, glycoproteins and glycolipids form a dense carbohydrate-rich layer on the cell surface, and this layer is called a glycocalyx. Now let's consider the fluid mosaic model of membrane structure. Membranes consist of a phospholipid bilayer with a lot of different proteins and other molecules. Peripheral proteins are on the surface and integral proteins are embedded in the bilayer. Carbohydrates are attached to some proteins or lipids, and all these molecules together form a mosaic of different parts. The parts are able to move laterally, so the membrane is fluid. This fluidity can be regulated by the cell. For example, cholesterol increases fluidity. So that's the fluid mosaic model. That's all for now. See you next time.